The setting was the scorched earth of Tunisia, July 1943. North Africa, finally secured, had become the launch pad for the next great thrust, Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. For the men of the 1st Airlanding Brigade of the 1st Airborne Division, their mission was a high-risk precision strike that would determine the pace of the entire campaign. These were the glider troops. They represented the cutting edge of military thought, a tactical refinement born from the painful lessons of early airborne experimentation. Unlike paratroopers, who jumped into the dark relying on decentralized deployment and often scattering across vast drop zones, glider-borne forces were essential for concentration. They were designed for a concentrated, silent landing with the capability of delivering heavier support weapons, like jeeps and anti-tank guns, directly onto the objective. This immediate combat power and relative cohesion was deemed crucial for a precise target like the bridge. Their objective was singular, vital, and non-negotiable: the Ponte Grande bridge near Syracuse. This ancient stone arch crossing the river Anapo was more than just a crossing. It was the sole viable coastal road bridge for miles, a strategic bottleneck that commanded all vehicular access into Syracuse from the south. If the bridge was blown, the vast seaborne forces of the British 8th Army would stall for days, consuming precious time and giving Axis defenders the opportunity to organize and launch coordinated counterthrusts. Their commander, Brigadier Philip Hicks, instilled a relentless focus. The training camps in the desert had been a blur of dry dust and grueling drills, punctuated by the rhythmic snapping of their new gliders, the massive British Horsas and the smaller American Wacos. The soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, South Staffordshire Regiment, were the absolute tip of this spear. They studied the maps, memorizing every contour of the coast, understanding that their success relied on perfect coordination and, crucially, favourable weather. The atmosphere was a complex, charged mixture of professional pride and a deep, unsettling apprehension. The seasoned men often sought refuge in the quiet ritual of cleaning their weapons, the oily smell of steel and rifle solvent a temporary comfort against the mounting psychological pressure. They knew that the cost of failure would be paid in blood. On the evening of July 9th, 144 gliders were packed. Every man carried the weight of the mission. They exchanged final words, a bleak, shared ritual of dark humour, and climbed into the unpowered wooden shells, tethered by thick tow ropes to their tug aircraft. The engines began to roar, the noise a deep physical vibration that resonated through the floorboards. At 6 p.m. they took off, heading out over the Mediterranean. They were flying into the dark, pioneers of a desperate gamble, unaware that the true enemy awaiting them was not the Italian garrison, but the unforgiving sea. The journey should have been a model of controlled insertion. It became a protracted disaster that tested the absolute limits of human endurance and exposed the terrifying vulnerability of the entire system. The immediate culprit was the weather. A severe unseasonal sirocco wind, a gale of unrelenting force, lashed the sea and battered the aircraft. Flying at dangerously low altitude to evade Axis radar, the tow planes struggled against the relentless headwind. The massive box-like gliders were tossed about like corks. Inside, the soldiers were violently airsick, their fear compounded by the physical agony of the turbulence. The smell of unspent diesel and vomit mingled in the confined dark space, a prelude to the terror to come. Then came the second, equally deadly enemy: confusion and panic among the pilots. Many tug crews lacked experience, and when the Italian anti-aircraft fire, the sharp, bright flash of tracer fire spearing the night sky, began to erupt from the Sicilian coast, the pilots took frantic, evasive action. Gliders were violently detached, their tow ropes snapping like taut string. Pilots, mistaking bursts of flak for the coast, or simply panicking, released their gliders miles out to sea over dark, deep water. The result was a tragedy of unparalleled scale. 69 gliders crashed into the churning Mediterranean. The majority of the casualties occurred miles out to sea, their occupants sinking with their equipment. The final figures were heartbreaking. Between 300 and 326 men were immediately presumed drowned, lost without ever reaching the island. The desperate cries of the men, muffled by the wind and the waves, were a terrifying, unheard symphony of death. It was a disaster so vast that, by the time the first glider touched down, the mission was already doomed on paper. The required strength, the 6-pounders, the jeeps, the hundreds of fighting men, was gone. When all the numbers were tallied, including those killed, wounded or captured later, the 1st Airlanding Brigade had suffered over 600 total casualties in Operation Ladbroke. The men who survived the flight emerged onto the Sicilian shore soaked and bruised, confronting the terrifying scale of the loss. The operational failure had been total. Yet, amid the wreckage, a dramatic contrast emerged. From this absolute tragedy, a slim, desperate hope was born. The mission, already failed in its execution, would now be salvaged by the pure, terrifying grit of the few, fragmented groups who had defied the sea. They were scattered, isolated, and alone, but they were breathing, and the objective was near. Amidst the chaos and widespread destruction, a single glider, against all probability, hit its mark. It carried the platoon of Lieutenant Louis Withers of the 2nd Battalion, South Staffordshire Regiment. Their Horsa shuddered violently as it scraped over trees, finally crash-landing in the scrubland near the Ponte Grande. The air inside, thick with the smell of fear and burning wood, now settled into the damp, cold scent of the riverbank, a smell of solid ground and purpose. Withers, a man now bearing the overwhelming pressure of command, quickly processed the disaster and recognized his unique position. His small platoon was the sole coherent force available. Every other group was scattered or destroyed. The realization that the fate of the entire invasion sector rested on his 30 men was a staggering weight of responsibility. He had no time for hesitation. The mission required immediate, flawless execution. The enemy objective was simple: blow the bridge. The British objective was simpler: stop them. The bridge was defended by the Italian 120th Coastal Infantry Regiment. These were not professional shock troops, but coastal battalions, lightly equipped Italian defensive units, often comprising older reservists or local conscripts, whose primary job was manning fixed pillboxes and coastal artillery, not sustaining a prolonged infantry defence. Withers knew he had to neutralise them with speed and surprise before they could execute the demolition. In a dramatic, high-stakes leadership moment, he decided to divide his already tiny force. This was a profound gamble. Splitting 30 men into 2 groups invited mutual destruction, but it was the only way to achieve the critical simultaneity required to overwhelm the garrison. He ordered the main group to engage the garrison from the south, drawing fire and attention. Withers, with 5 other men, the absolute minimum required for the task, executed a daring flank manoeuvre. They plunged into the canal Mamayabaca, the cold, dark water shocking their systems, and swam to the opposite bank. The moment was thick with danger. The sound of their quiet, desperate breathing was the only noise louder than the distant sea, and any slip on the mud bank could alert the Italian sentries. The assault was initiated with surgical precision. The small group on the far bank drew the Italian fire, distracting the primary garrison. Simultaneously, Withers's infiltration team raced toward the bridge supports. Their priority was not the soldiers, but the demolition charges. Under the flickering light of distant coastal fires and the probing fingers of the Italian searchlights, the men located the heavy explosive blocks and the crucial detonator wires. They worked with focused intensity, their hands scrambling to sever the wires and pull out the charges, neutralizing the most critical threat to the invasion. The feeling of the thick, waxed cord under their knives was the moment of victory. With the explosives safely removed, the assault turned on the garrison, taken completely by surprise by the simultaneous attack from two sides and realizing their demolition option was gone. The Italian defenders' will to fight broke. They were overwhelmed and taken prisoner. In a stunning demonstration of initiative and resolve, Lieutenant Withers' platoon captured the Ponte Grande bridge completely intact, suffering 0 casualties in the initial pivotal assault. By the first moments of true dawn on July 10th, the key to Syracuse was secure. But the victory was only temporary. The true ordeal, the crucible of defence, had begun. As the sun crept above the horizon, painting the sky with the violent colours of the burgeoning invasion, the British force began to consolidate. Over the next few hours, stragglers, dazed pilots, technicians and scattered infantry navigated their way toward the sound of their comrades' firing, swelling the defence force. By 8:30, the entire organised unit holding the bridge numbered just 89 men. They were severely under-equipped, lacking anti-tank guns and heavy support. The smell of cordite and salt air hung heavy over the new perimeter as they desperately dug in. The promised relief from the seaborne troops, expected around 10 a.m., was nowhere in sight. They were completely alone, and the battle for time was now a battle for survival. The Italian command, receiving frantic reports that the critical bridge was in enemy hands, reacted violently. The British defenders were soon pinned down by a relentless and highly effective counterattack. They deployed seasoned elements of the formidable 54th Napoli Infantry Division alongside the remnants of the coastal units. The defence became a study in attrition. Italian artillery and mortars immediately bracketed the bridge, the thud of mortars echoing off the riverbanks and shaking the very earth. The British soldiers, spread thin, suffered continuous casualties from the shelling before the infantry even closed in. The constant deafening noise and the lack of cover turned the area into a killing ground. On-land casualties among the defenders were high. Records indicate that approximately 14 men were killed and 37 were wounded during the initial hours of the defence. Every casualty meant a wider gap in the thin, fragile line. The counterattacks were wave after wave, demanding every ounce of physical and psychological resilience. The British, low on water and completely isolated, used every piece of cover, every fold in the ground to maximise their limited firepower. The fighting was often so close that the men could hear the commands of the Italian officers and the scraping of their boots in the dirt. The pressure mounted until, in a bizarre and desperate act, an Italian unit mounted a cavalry charge. The spectacle of horsemen galloping against modern machine gun fire highlighted the savage, anachronistic nature of the fighting. The British held, repelling the charge, but the exhaustion was profound. The hours stretched past noon. Lieutenant Withers and his remaining leaders fought with a terrible clarity, knowing that every minute they survived was a strategic victory for the entire invasion, but time was running out. The hours between noon and mid-afternoon were defined by pure, raw endurance. The defenders, their uniforms soaked in sweat and blood, operated on fumes. They had fulfilled the operational requirement of seizing the bridge, but now they were locked in a personal battle for survival, their fire superiority long gone. The Italian forces, sensing the defenders' exhaustion, launched their final overwhelming push. The intensity was unbearable. The remnants of the British force were pinned down, unable to move, unable to reply to the constant shelling. Their position was no longer tenable. Around 3:30 p.m., Lieutenant Withers looked upon the devastating toll. The initial force of 89 was now tragically reduced to just 18 unwounded active fighters. He looked at the faces of his men, grim, blood-spattered, their eyes burning with a desperate, exhausted defiance. He weighed the raw military calculus. They had no ammunition left. To continue was merely to die, not to fight. He had a duty not only to the mission, but to the lives he commanded. The decision was an agonizing one, a betrayal of everything they had fought for that day, but a necessity to preserve life. With the heaviest burden of leadership, Withers gave the heartbreaking order to cease fire. The 18 fighters of the 2nd Battalion, South Staffordshire Regiment, surrendered. There was a moment of profound, defeated silence as the guns fell quiet, a silence so sudden and total that it felt heavier than the battle's roar. The men were disarmed and marched away, their movements slow, agonizingly final. They were defeated. The bridge was lost. It was a slow, crushing emotional drop, the physical relief of the cessation of fire immediately replaced by the cold, deep shame of failure. They had done the impossible for 12 hours, only to fall short at the last. Yet, this moment of profound despair was precisely the end of their mission. Their delay had worked. As Withers and his men were being marched away into temporary captivity, a new sound began to rumble over the horizon, displacing the sudden silence. The distant, powerful, unmistakable roar of British armour. The leading elements of the British 5th Infantry Division were finally driving toward the coast. The timing was immaculate. Less than 2 hours after Withers's surrender, the vanguard of the seaborne force, the 17th Infantry Brigade, hit the Ponte Grande. The Italian garrison, exhausted from the long day's battle and demoralized by the sight of fresh, heavy forces, collapsed almost immediately. The bridge was retaken, and in the ensuing chaos the captured glider men were freed, their long, harrowing ordeal complete. By nightfall on July 10th, the invasion was secured. The tanks of the British 8th Army were streaming across the Ponte Grande, ensuring the swift capture of Syracuse. The action at the bridge remains an enduring study in military necessity and human courage. The operational disaster of the initial landing, with its over 600 total casualties and the tragic loss of approximately 300 to 326 men drowned in the sea, was a profound, expensive failure in planning. But the strategic victory was undeniable. It was the isolated tenacity of a small band of soldiers, led by a clear-sighted officer, that saved the invasion. The courage of Lieutenant Withers and his men, from the zero-casualty seizure of the bridge to the defence by the final 18 fighters, broke the Italian timetable. Their stubborn refusal to yield forced the enemy to commit crucial forces and time, allowing the seaborne troops to gain their foothold. Their action bought the necessary hours at a cost that transcended all logistical calculation. The soldiers of the 2nd Battalion exemplified the ethical requirement of their duty, fighting with meticulous attention to their task until their resources were absolutely spent. Their struggle for a few square meters of stone arch became the silent hinge on which the door to Europe swung open. The Ponte Grande stands today, a quiet, stoic monument to the many who never saw the shore and the few who, by their sheer will, turned disaster into lasting victory, forever embodying the ultimate price of airborne courage.